worries.
Well, Britt, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
We were just giggling because my process for scheduling and informing people of details is improved now. Everyone's always asking me, is it video and audio? I'm always like, it's both, but yes. So here we are. We're going to publish this on YouTube as well. And my producer will pull some clips for promotion. So I'm super excited about that. Yay. But I'm so excited to have you. And I will start asking questions very soon. But it was so funny because I was talking to Janine from Chasing Heroin podcast, and she was like, "Oh, do you know who Britt Frank is?" And I was like, "Gosh, that name sounds familiar." And then she said she's wrote The Science of Stuck, and I about fell out of my chair because that morning I couldn't sleep, and I like to listen to audiobooks. Sometimes it just helps me go back to sleep. Not that I chose your book to go back to sleep, but that sounds terrible.
Whatever gets the job done.
No, but I love the practical suggestions in the book. So I had just been listening to it that morning. So for her to mention you on her podcast,
I love it when that happens.
I love synchronicity. So yeah, she introduced me to you, and here we are. So we're going to talk about the science of stuck. Yes. I'm going to go over some of the chapter titles just to give people a glimpse into what we're going to discuss. But you do talk about how anxiety is a superpower. I was like, what is that? And then the hidden benefits of staying stuck. And I think this is so important. It's kind of through that lens of compassion of why we are the way we are. It felt very compassionate to me. The myth of motivation. We're going to do a little deep dive on shadow intelligence, why you need parts of yourself you hate, because I feel like people in recovery are often overcoming a lot of shame. So we need to understand. You need to understand that. So how to human, 3 crash courses on intimacy, 6 is the sticky world of friendships and dating. I know people are going to want to know about that one too. You might have to just get the book.
We'll cover everything we can.
Everything we can. Emotionally unskilled family, trust your instruments, how to recover from toxic habits. Who doesn't need that? Becoming an emotional adult, and let's play. So before we jump in, I'm going to skip the lightning round because it usually is not lightning at all. It's very slow. So, but I kind of want to get into your story a little bit because I don't really know that much about your story other than what you said, which I thought was hilarious, which is your life was more like smoke, cry, binge than eat, pray, love. And then you talked about Vicodin and meth. And so I was like, we have to get into it. So maybe, and I'm always interested in, I feel like childhood is like setting the stage for everything that comes later. So, share as much as or as little as you feel comfortable with, sort of like the, what happened, what it was like, and what it's like now type of thing.
Yeah, that whole thing. So I thought I was like the one and it's such a narcissistic thing. I'm the only one who had what looked like a normal childhood, but in actuality was not. But I really grew up believing because it did not look bad. It's very easy to see that is bad. This type of family dynamic is bad. This type of environment is bad. But there's a lot of ways to get screwed up as a human besides the obvious ones. And again, not comparing, but in my head growing up, it was just, my normal to have no parent-child boundaries and to have no sexual boundaries or body boundaries or any type of privacy. And everyone watches porn with their family at the age of 8. Like that's a thing everybody does.
What?
So as most people do, I grew up, the first addictions I found myself drawn to were the ones I had the most proximity to. And at 8, 9, 10, that was porn. I did not have access to drugs or alcohol. Had I would have done those. And so then, you get to be a teenager, and the easiest to come by drug is a relationship, sex addiction kind of combo. And then I was able to do school concurrently with my addiction, which I don't know why that was a thing, but I was able to go to college. I was able to get good grades. I was able to function, all the while descending into the spiral of madness. And my drugs of choice were really proximity based. So it was Vicodin for a while, it was Xanax for a while, it was cocaine for a minute. Meth is cheaper and lasts longer. And so there was that. And really just a hot mess. So I had all of the trauma from childhood that I didn't know was trauma, and then all of the trauma that I caused in my attempts to cope with what I thought was just my own brain being crazy. Now I had someone message me like, I hate that you use the word crazy. I'm like, no. Crazy is not a biological clinical reality. Crazy is that feeling that something is wrong with us, but we have no identifiable origin why. And that's just not true. I felt crazy, but there's no such thing as a crazy person. Like even what we see in the clinical world as high level mental health pathology is not crazy. It's like, yeah, that makes sense. Their brain is doing X because Y. But I digress. So, like many people, I came to the healing world from my own journey, and it was not linear. It wasn't like I woke up and had a flash of insight and suddenly I had motivation to do the work. It was like little spurts here and there. I joined a religious cult for a while because I thought that would be a good plan. And it was for a minute until it wasn't. 10 out of 10 do not recommend. But, through my journey, I sort of gather, when I look down at like in my hands, what do I have? All of these tools that I've gathered, some that I've used, some that I've not, some that worked really well when I did them, some that didn't. And I was fortunate to find my way to a trauma therapist who understood that we have brains and our brains do things. And if we know how brains brain, our lives work better. And I don't know what I mean, most people learn to drive by driver's ed or somebody teaching them, but I wasn't given driver's ed for my brain. I assume you aren't either. Most people aren't. And then we wonder why we crash. It's like there are ways of driving these brains and bodies of ours. They're not, our lives aren't easy, but the tools to drive are. And I was horrified to learn that it's not easy, but it's simple. Like it was like, really? All of this pain and trauma that I've endured and caused, and it's this simple? It's like, yeah, damn it.
Yeah, it is confusing. I mean, typically the way we learn how to live life is through example, right? And if you don't have example, I mean, you mentioned, something it really kind of shocked me, pornography. Thank you for mentioning pornography. A lot of women don't. I have rarely hear women talk about it. I had early exposure to pornography as well, and I was like, oh my God, what is that? It's
And people
very.
don't label that as sexual abuse. Now, I had all of the different kinds of sexual abuse and trauma and assault through my timeline.
You
But the
did.
earliest, like that I have cognitive memories are of these very graphic, violent pornography scenes. And to a developing child,
Oh my
that,
God.
again, I'm not comparing someone that's been physically assaulted to someone that's watched graphic physical assault, but the impact on a child's brain is very similar. And
Yeah.
so I wouldn't have even categorized a lot of the weird or sexual stuff as abuse, because often, and no one wants to talk about this, but it's a thing. Often abuse does not feel abusive when it's happening, especially as a child when we're
Yeah.
biologically wired to respond. It's,
I know.
unwanted arousal is what it's called. And it's a thing,
Mm.
and it's such a source of shame. So it's like, all right, if I have to
Oh
talk
my
about it to
gosh.
normalize it, fine.
Fine. Yeah, no, I had a lot of unwanted arousal when I was young and didn't know how to process that. And it was very confusing because it shaped my identity. And I was confused about who I was for a long time. And
Mhm.
and it was very shame provoking. And it took me years to recognize it. I mean, I was like a decade or more into recovery and therapy, right? Like trauma. I don't know if I would call it trauma therapy. Maybe it was, but I was had deep into like 10 years, 15 years of therapy before I like really got to the core of how much that hurt me and altered the course of my life. Right. But you mentioned that you had viewed this porn in front of your family. How does that even happen?
It's just what was normal,
Like they
like,
had it on in the
yeah,
family room.
yeah.
It was on the TV, and
Yeah.
were your parents married?
Yeah. So I'm really mindful of not getting too into the weeds with like specifics and details, just like high level.
Yeah, say
It was a family affair to do, but
okay.
to get into the nitty gritty of how does it work and da 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 is just, I don't think that's necessarily helpful for
Yeah.
people. So,
Well, I'm just curious because it can present in a bunch of different ways,
hmm.
right? Either it's out in the open and we're just supposed to pretend like it's normal, or it is secretive. And I think the experience, it's different if your parents are there or if they're not there,
Hmm.
right? And so, because I think that changes how we internalize that information. So
Sure.
yeah, I appreciate you sharing as much or as little as you want. I just wanted to clarify. So okay, so how old were you when you started using drugs
Uh,
or drinking, or I don't know what came first?
Chemicals, and again, I don't have a I do my recovery a little bit atypical of this, and I've worked the 12 steps. The 12-step room saved my life. I don't subscribe adherently to that philosophy. I don't have a sobriety date. I used so many different things. It's like, well, I first ingested a chemical when I was 14, and
Mhm.
then it was off and on. I didn't start using meth until later. So it's like, well, sober from what and for how long just got me again in the weeds of the nitty-gritty details, which weren't helpful for me. So
Uh-huh.
like I don't count days. And again, if counting sobriety days works for people, which for
Oh,
many it does, awesome. I don't do it.
yeah. Yeah, no, I didn't ask you what your sobriety date, but I
Oh no,
think it
no,
was,
I know. I'm just jumping ahead of the curve on that
yeah,
one.
just curious of like when it started, because I started
Teenager.
very early as well, because it's sort of that's how people identify. It's like, oh, I started young too, and so
Sure.
but definitely things like sex and porn and stuff like that will chemically alter your brain as well, for sure.
It's confusing.
So confusing. So let's just jump ahead and talk about, when did you decide that it was, actually in the book, you talk about a story. I'm looking at my notes where you met your shadow self when you were, do you want to talk about that part?
It's so
This is how we
funny. It's like
acknowledged a problem.
everyone's like, well, what was there a pivotal moment? And again, I think this like, here was the moment I turned, everything was better, that story, which is such a great, neat and clean and tidy thing. But for the purposes of storytelling in my book, if I had to pinpoint like okay, this is me, I am the problem, was it like 5 in the morning after a multi-day meth bender, and I'd always justified my meth use as it's just recreational. And this is like, I
Casual.
realize what that sounds like now, but
Yeah,
at the
yeah,
time, denial is a very powerful
yeah.
mechanism. So I'm like, well, I've always done meth with other people. Therefore, I'm a social user. Therefore, it's fine. And this was like after a multi-day bender, I was sitting on a toilet in this like disgusting bathroom at like 5 in the morning by myself. And I'm like, it's me. I'm the problem. And that was kind of the, not the light bulb moment from where everything changed, but if I had to pick one, it would be that one.
Yeah, that is a very pivotal moment to recognize, this isn't casual use, and I think people can relate to that in terms of drinking, where you have this moment, you recognize, I think this is a problem, but a lot of people recognize that there is a problem and then learn to live with it, right? So, how did you decide that you were going to take some action and find out what was underneath all of this?
Again, that's been like a multi-decade. I first decided to start taking action as soon as I learned that there were people and I didn't do what normal people, quote, normal people did, and my brain doesn't seem to function in the same way. And so I started studying people from a very early age. I wouldn't say that that was, quote, recovery, but I started gathering data about like, I would learn different healing things. I wouldn't implement them, but I would learn them. And that's interesting. And I would read and watch different things and go, oh, that's interesting. But it really was a very, very windy back and forth spiral of do things, don't do things, go forward, go backwards some more, burn everything to the ground and move. So it wasn't like I
I'm
came to the
familiar.
decision to do it. It was, again, I was very fortunate that when I got to that 5 a.m. in the bathroom meth point in my life, I had enough knowledge, like head knowledge of available resources and tools that I was able to then start implementing them in a more serious way.
Yeah, I love what you said in the book about, let me see if I can find the quote. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, but you have the ability to think differently and act differently to the degree that you have willingness to do so, choices and access to resources. I said it in the wrong order, but I wrote that down because I was like, yeah, thinking differently, hugely important, but being able to act differently, first you have to think it and then, or not, maybe, I don't know if you're going to challenge me on that, but, thinking differently and acting differently, really, is correlated with willingness, the choices and access to resources. And it astounds me that, I've talked before on the podcast and we'll talk about resources today. Like, wow, there are so many resources, it can be overwhelming. And people are like, oh my God, what are you talking about? So that's why I always, we always talk about people's stories in the beginnings, but it's, for me, I think what's really important is, what are the resources? If someone's willing enough to listen to this podcast, then we can talk about the resources, which you have many, many resources in your book. I love your book for so many reasons, not just because it is, and thank you for sharing about your story. But I love your book because you have such a clarity in thinking and such a good grasp of what addiction is, what it isn't. You talked about it not being linear, and I think that really gives grace to people who are struggling with this thing, people do think in linear terms of like, okay, my life is a hot mess, from a 30-foot view, it's like, okay, my life is a hot mess. And then something happened to me. And then I was like, I just can't do this anymore. That period can be a lot. There's a lot of back and forth there. It took me 2 years myself to decide I needed to get help before I was able to really submit to the practice. Right. And then, I've been, it's been a long time since then. So, but yeah, while you're in it, it's messy.
So messy. And I'm really glad that you brought up the, change is possible to the degree that you have willingness and access, because
Yeah.
I think a lot of people in the wellness world specifically focus on you just need to be willing. And that's great,
Mm,
but willingness without access, and I don't just mean like access to resources on the internet, because that's we all have access to that information. But things like access to safety, it's really hard to
ooh,
make really significant changes, to go through detox and withdrawal, to go through the process of like trauma integrate or whatever you're doing. It's really hard to do that if you're in an oppressive environment, if you're subject to like systemic forces that are, lined up and stacked against you. So it was really important to me to really name, it's not just willingness. It's not like the willing win, which can be a really toxic message. It's willingness plus access to resources plus enough safety that you can do this work, because you need a safe place to do the work for the work to work. And so
mhm.
I thank you for saying that. That's always my disclaimer. Anything I talk about, whether it's, body work or shadow work or cognitive work, none of that work tends to work if you are like, if you're in the middle of a war zone, you can manifest, do affirmations all day long. You can chart out
Yeah.
your mind map of your sub personalities, but none of that's going to work if you're being shot at. So,
Yeah.
willingness plus safety plus access equals recovery in my book.
Yeah. I love the safety aspect too, because if you're in a domestic violence situation or even and I think abuse can be in degrees too, right? Like you can be in a household where there's one or two people that are, badgering you or berating you or practicing unhealthy behaviors. I mean, I feel like that's why recovery in general is so challenging, because there are
Mm-hmm.
so many variables and so many like I have been times I have taken action when I'm the most willing after like a lot of pain, right? And then when the pain eases off and I start getting comfortable, the degree of my willingness lessens.
Right.
So, but then, they say the pain is a touchstone of all growth. I could see there's some truth to that where I'm like, yeah, that's a thing for me. So
I probably didn't need to go to the extreme, like when people are like pain is, and I agree, like you don't go to the gym and build muscle without tearing your muscles. So yes, pain is necessary, but like not injury. I compare it to like working out. You want to
yeah,
work
not
out till
injury.
it hurts, but not like harms. And
Right.
recovery should be like it should hurt, but not harm. And again, that's why I did the cult thing. I'm like, no, I have to go hard as I possibly can into be good. And so I took it from recovery hurts to recovery harms to like that doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
But it's really messy. And when you
I
get
see.
comfortable, it's often because your level of safety increases. So
Yeah.
as safety increase, willingness can decrease. But then once your willingness increases, if you don't have enough safety, all the willingness in the world isn't going to necessarily help. It is very complicated.
It is. And you know what's interesting is as somebody who has had a sponsor and done lots of therapy and as a coach and a sponsor myself, I have noticed that when I can facilitate a space of safety, or when someone does that for me, that's when all my stuff is allowed
Mhm.
to come up.
Yeah.
And then with support, support, like, there's a reason there's support groups, right? With support, I'm able to process my stuff to resolution. I'm able to receive context and perspective that change the way I think and how I feel and how I identify. And it just, the result is feeling freer and more peaceful in the world. Um, but I want to talk to you a little bit about, it's the science of stuck, right? And I feel like everybody relates to that place of feeling stuck. And you have this line in your book that I'm reading that says, there is a reason you are stuck, and it's not laziness. Stuck is not a mental illness, it's a body response. And I think, it just struck me as so obvious once you pointed out that, we do this thing where we disassociate, we go, like, I used to love to live in my brain and to disconnect from my body, but it wasn't until I did the somatic healing that the things really started, like the triggers started easing up. Can you talk to me a little bit about how that works, and or as it makes sense to you?
Yeah, like I mean, in what context I can
Well,
go any
so
number of directions
I'm
with
sure you
that.
can. Yeah. Well, let's just talk about how, if you are stuck, like, I always look at everything through the lens of compassion. Let's just talk about how it's not laziness.
Yes. Because I'm like, oh, we want to go somatic. So stuck, I call the book The Science of Stuck and not the science of trauma, because not everyone identifies as having trauma, which is its own
So smart.
conversation. But like we're not having that one right now. We're talking about stuck. Not everyone identifies as having a severe mental illness. Like, okay, but there's no one walking around that does not know what it's like to get stuck with something. It might not be drug addiction. It might be career dissatisfaction. It might not be, what I did. It might be revenge bedtime procrastination. But everyone is familiar to a degree with the dilemma. I shouldn't say everyone. Our general culture that we operate in, you know, I know there's things I should be doing. It's not like I don't know what to do. Nevertheless, I'm not doing it. Therefore, I must be lazy. And stuck is what I call when we're in that gap between what we know we want to do and then what we actually end up doing. And the reason that we get stuck isn't laziness. And there are physiological biological body based reasons why you're not going for a run after work, why you're opening up the second bottle of Chardonnay, why you're not making the calls to the friends that you know would be there to, like, there are reasons that we do that. And laziness is not, as long as we think it's a lazy issue, we're never going to get moving, because that's not the reason. If you're operating under the assumption that, oh well, I guess I'm just lazy, then you're stuck. If it's, oh, I'm not doing what I want to do, or I'm doing something that I don't want to do, and I understand the mechanism that's causing this, then I can change it.
Yeah, no, that's really important. You talked about, so how do we, once we recognize that it's a physiological thing, um, you know, I know you have tons of little practices in the book. What is something that will help somebody recognize that they are stuck? And then what may be some steps to get out of it?
So I'm so funny. People say to me, well, why should I believe you? You know, like, how do I know if I'm stuck? I'm like, I don't know. I'm like, how's your life working? How's your relationship to sex, food, finances, enjoyment, pleasure, play, and other people? Like, if you're
Yeah.
good with where you're at, I'm not here to sell you on why you should do this work. Like, don't, like, do
Yeah.
you? I'm
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
big on autonomy, but,
Yeah.
I would guess that you're not hot, you're not hitting on all cylinders in every single area of life, and that's fine. And so if, how do I know if I'm stuck? It's just how are things really going if I were to look up close?
Yeah.
And the path from stuck to unstuck, I did too. I got so frustrated with this. I'm like, this is so stupid. I'm like, yeah, but it does work. And it works with everything from procrastinating mowing the lawn to like getting off the toilet at 5 in the morning and quitting meth. It's the same process. I call them the three micro yes, or the three steps to unstuck. One, don't ask why. Like, why are you stuck in this moment is not relevant. Why is the building on fire is not a good question to ask when the building's burning down. Like, forget why. Step two, I call these micro yeses. Pick three micro yeses. They're not even baby steps. Like, take a baby step, cut it into thousandths, and that's a micro yes. And then like make a list of three that you can do right now, that you don't have to wait until you have 3 days of sobriety, that you don't need to wait till you have the right gear and the right day planner with the right markers. It's like, what are three microscopic yeses available to you right now? Of those three, pick one. So step one, don't ask why, ask what. Step two, what are three micro yeses? Step three, pick one and do it. So like what this looks like practically, my micro yes, when I left the bathroom and got to where I was staying, I called my sponsor and she's like, Britt, when was and I'm crying. And then it's like, oh my God, everything. But she's like, Britt, when was the last time you ate food? I'm like, I don't know. She's like, what's in your fridge? And this woman, this wonderful woman, talked me through eating a yogurt spoon by spoonful for an hour. That was my micro yes. It was not take a shower. It was not take a breath. It was not meditate. It was not journal. It was open fridge, remove Yoplait, eat it. That's my micro yes. And change on the smallest level to the biggest level happens as a series of micro yeses. If you're not taking steps that you think are small, it's because your brain thinks they're big and your brain gets to make that call. So if you make them microscopic, a micro yes is the smallest thing you can do without your nervous system flipping out on you and putting you in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. And they work.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Don't ask why, ask what. So like, what can I do? Is that the,
Yeah.
uh-huh.
Don't ask why, ask what. Two, what am I asking? What are three micro yeses? Step three, pick one, do it.
Pick one and do it.
It
No, I
sounds
love
so
it.
simple. And again, high level trauma. I've been in domestically violent situations. I've been assaulted. I understand that it's not easy to survive in these environments, but it's not because I have a lack of compassion that I'm saying it's easy. It's because we're
Mhm.
talking micro yeses are actually doable for anyone. I don't know what someone else's yeses will be in a certain situation, but whatever they are, it doesn't matter. Make them microscopically small so you can do them, and then eventually they stack up to bigger changes. I wasn't going to be able to leave my sex and love addiction causing these violent relationships. Like, that's not my starting place, because I couldn't at the time. But I could do something like join a support group. I could do something like tell somebody what was going on with me. I could on any given day try to maximize my hours outside the home so I didn't have to go back there. I mean, I shouldn't say always, there's almost always a tiny microscopic step that you can do, but we're so quick to minimize them because it's like, well, how am I going to do anything if I'm taking a step that small? And my answer is a lot faster than if you don't, and then you stay frozen and stuck. So micro
Right.
yeses get us moving.
Oh, that's brilliant. Um, Gosh, there's so many different ways, so many different places we could go with this. Okay, so I'm sort of the mindset of mood follows action. And I love how if we just break it down into teeny tiny little action, that it actually changes our mood. Cause I know for me, it's like I'm waiting until I feel like it.
That doesn't
Um,
work. It
yeah.
doesn't
And,
work.
and then if I wait and it actually works the other way around.
Yeah.
So yeah. Um, so maybe we could talk a little bit about, you mentioned, I think it's even in the author's note very early on about procrastination, motivation, relationships, habits, overwhelm. So these are the topics that you sort of cover in broad at a high level. What did you call it? Like a drive-by?
Oh, it's like a speedboat tour around the
Tour.
island of humaning. Like most
Yes,
people, and I like the deep dive into the abyss. I imagine you do too, and
I
probably
do.
people listening really love the deep dive, but not everybody does. So I wrote the book. So if you just want a speedboat tour, this book is not a let's sit there and read it for hours and hours. If you want a deep dive, it's there. But I wrote it so you can literally like leave it laying around open to any page and there's a nugget there for you to grab. So you don't have to read it in order. You don't have to, read topics that are irrelevant to you. I've sort of batched it so it's a choose your own adventure kind of thing.
I love this so good. And that's kind of why I read off the book chapters because we're going to jump to chapter 4, the shadow intelligence. But like you said in the very beginning, that recovery is not linear and each day presents its own unique set of challenges. So it's nice to be able to have something where you can just go to the chapter and then get an exercise to sort of help you make forward progress. So let's talk a little bit. It's so interesting. I want to talk about the shadow side because oftentimes, I was in this mindset where I identified what in 12 steps they call character defects, which I hate. I know you do
Mm-hmm.
too. Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe hate is a strong word, but I'm not sure how productive it is. I understand the need to recognize where I'm making a misstep, but I prefer to think of them as like human frailties or survival skills, unadaptive survival skills. But in plain terms, like there were parts of me that I hated. When I first got sober, I hated who I was and I wanted to be anybody but me. I totally identified with the chameleon. I'll just be whoever you want me to be. That's easier than just because I was so disassociated from who I really was. Right. But then in the work of recovery, it was about recovering my whole self, the good
Mm-hmm.
parts and the bad. And I had a sponsor that kind of laid down the gauntlet. And she was like, "Can you love your unlovable parts?" And I thought she was
Mm.
insane. I was like, "What are you talking about?" But that has absolutely been like this way for me to really have compassion for myself. And so you mentioned in the book 2 examples of the shadow, Bruce Wayne and Walter White. Could I have you sort of give a brief description of these? these?
Yeah, I really like pop culture references. I think there's no need to make this esoteric and inaccessible, like trying to read Carl Jung, and I love Jung's work,
Oh
but
my
it is
gosh.
such a snooze and I like have to force myself to stay awake to get through it.
I
So
like
I'm
his
like,
quotes.
I love his quotes. Like he's very like Instagrammable, but trying to
Yeah.
read through, it's like, oh my God, this is so
A
hard.
slog.
It's so hard. So, like, okay, like, first of all, what is the shadow? The shadow is just anywhere where we're not conscious of our tendencies and we're either in charge of or driven by them. So, I like Bruce Wayne and Batman. It's like he's got all this rage and all. Now, again, the morality of vigilantism is not what I'm talking about. I'm just saying, in
Right.
general,
Like calm down,
Bruce,
people.
right. Don't DM me like this is
Yeah.
the okay.
Yeah.
So, like, generally speaking, Bruce Wayne has all this rage. He didn't know what to do with it. So he created an alter ego to fight for justice. Now, again, his methods, not the point. The point is he understands his limitation. And there's like a quote from one of, I think it's the Christopher Nolan Batman series. It's, it's not who I am underneath, but what I do that defines me. And I think it's really important because if we were all judged on our thoughts and on the
Oof.
impulses, we would all be toast. And so, I tell people all thoughts are like thoughts don't cost anything and thoughts don't harm anyone until they're turned and funneled into actions. And so Bruce Wayne is a good example of someone who understands that he's got this ragey, murderous impulse and he's channeled it into what he has decided is for the betterment of society. And Walter White from Breaking Bad was this like super sweet, nice guy, like, oh, look at him. He loves his wife and his family. And he like doesn't accept that, yeah, at the core of him is also a ragey monster. And so Bruce Wayne is an example of owning your shadow parts and driving them versus Walter White, who is being unconscious of them and turning into the monster that you fear. Like the more we face the dragons of the psyche, the less likely they are to burn us. And then when you get up close, you realize Oh, all those parts of myself that I hate, the parts that do drugs, the parts that manipulated, the parts that lied. Again, not justifying behavior. That's a whole nother conversation. But if you understand that parts are not their behaviors, that's why I don't like character defects. Like, I love what you said. It's out of their pain. These are the very not good ways they have chosen to act. So call them behavioral defects. I don't even like the word defect, but like, if you have to. But, shadow work is just about becoming conscious of all of the things about yourself that are true, whether or not you like them, whether or not they're cringy, whether or not they're good or bad. Is it true about you? And if so, we want to befriend that. So it's like kind of like first we want to escape the lions, then we want to tame and befriend the lions, and then we
Mhm.
realize like parts of us are the lions. And so we have a full set of characteristics, the good, the bad, and the WTF.
Well, and and coming back to Carl Jung, you quoted in your book, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
Mhm.
And I have definitely found that to be true. And I thought, you talked about truth. And when I was listening to the audiobook, you challenged the idea that about connection being what was it, the opposite of addiction?
The
And
opposite of addiction is connection.
yeah, you challenge that idea and to say that it's truth. And I couldn't agree more. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, my disclaimer here is I love Johann Hari's work. I
Me
love his
too.
books. I love his TED Talk. This
And
isn't
I
like
see what he means.
I totally get what he means, but I needed a hooky way to say what I was saying. And it's like, well, is the opposite of addiction really connection? Yes. And
And
connection is not the be all. It's not the panacea. If that were true,
no,
and I used to work in inpatient drug rehab. Instant connection. From the second you check in, you're connected to like-minded people who have the same set of issues. You're volunteering, you're in the community, you're doing meaningful work. And yet the numbers are abysmal for like outcomes for inpatient drug treatment because connection is not the thing. Connection is all well and good, but I was connected to people when I was full of crap, and that type of connection doesn't really get the job done. First, we have to be honest with ourselves about what's true about me, not just the bad stuff, but the good stuff. Most people think shadow work is just about owning my ragey, like murderous parts. It's like, no, it's also about owning your light and your power and your beauty and your talent and your creativity. All of that stuff tends to get shadowed too. But the opposite of addiction is truth. I had so many people mad at me about that too. Because, like, when you can
yeah,
tolerate all of the truth about you, what's happened to you, what you've done in reaction to what's happened to you, and somatic work is good for that because it's really hard to tolerate your truth if you don't understand that truth is stored in the body.
right.
Then addiction will always be necessary to help you escape from it. If you build a somatic system, if you build an awareness of your body that doesn't require an exit door, addiction is no longer necessary or functional. And then all those parts of you that did those terrible things are freed up to do better things,
Yeah. I think he was talking in terms of like the heart connection,
which I
right?
get.
Like, yeah, yeah. But you're right. But it's so interesting. We can, like you talk about, we can be around people, but feel so lonely and isolated because I'm not facilitating true connection. Like I'm hiding who I am because my shadow side I'm so ashamed of it. Right. And I think it's so interesting. I was telling you at some point that I was doing internal family systems,
Mhm.
which is all about, befriending your protector parts, right? How are protector parts maybe similar or different from your shadow side?
And again, I disclaim everything because I think it's important that none of this is to justify behavior. Like no one gets to
Thank you.
say my shadow parts made me do it, and
No, no,
because
no,
I was
no,
unconsciously in my like this is not a
no.
co-signing on bad behavior. It's
We're
an
talking about
explanation.
taking responsibility.
Yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. Because again, things tend to get twisted in internet land. So being
They
very, very
do.
clear, they really do.
Yeah.
So that's a whole nother
Did
topic.
you, as just a side note, or maybe I should ask you later, did you receive people challenging you on a lot of ideas, like for Johan Hari or?
No, I read a lot and I look at a lot of comment threads on posts that I
Yeah.
think could use a disclaimer or two just to see what people are
Yeah.
saying. And
Yeah.
again, I do think everyone has a responsibility to use the internet like with a grain of salt. However, it takes me 2 seconds to say, hey, just so you know, I've thought about this in case you haven't. And like, this is
Yeah.
not referring to this. This is not refer. I think it's obvious that I'm not excusing behavior, but I've
Yeah.
seen enough angry people raging at other
Oof.
people that I've learned
Yeah.
don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so funny. You were talking earlier about truth and the idea that the truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off.
Yeah.
A glorious time. It's like,
Yeah.
yeah. So we're presenting a lot of information that has the potential to kick something off. And anyone that's listening, I would just ask that you maybe take a moment to see where what's underneath that trigger.
It's tough. And sometimes the triggers are legit, when people are
They're
raging
always
online at
valid.
like, well, what about privilege and it's like, you're right. Like there are more
Those are
skillful ways
valid.
of expressing that for some people, but like,
Yeah.
okay, that's a fair point. So
Yeah.
let's speak to that. Your question about protectors
Yeah.
are only shadow parts if we're not aware of them. Like I was very aware that I had parts of me that coped with eating disorders and with relationships and with distractions and numbings. I didn't know that I had other parts that used like other things to keep me away from like denial and
Mhm.
repression and projection. And I just thought that those are the bad people. And I am not the bad person. I am the person that the bad things happen to. And like, that's true. It's like, well,
Mhm.
okay, yes. But what's true about me? It's not just, and I'm only speaking for myself. It was
Mhm.
not, I'll use the domestic violence example. It would be very easy for me to say, I am being abused in my home. Therefore, I am good. I am victim. That is perpetrator. That is bad. Yes, I was being victimized. No, that wasn't my fault. No, the abuse is never the fault of the person being abused. However, being with bad people, quote, was a wonderful distraction from my own shit. Oh, pardon me.
Oh, you're fine.
It's thanks. It's really easy to deflect my own stuff when someone is acting in such a heinous way towards me. Again, doesn't mean that
Mhm.
what happened to me wasn't okay, like was okay. I'm not minimizing it. I am
Yeah.
saying ick, that was a shadow part when I realized, oh my gosh, one of the reasons I pick such toxic people is because I don't have to deal with me. If they're so bad, I get to focus on them.
Girl,
Yuck.
that is deep. That is, and that's a landmine. That's like a field of landmines I'm very reluctant to address, but I think you said that very eloquently.
I wouldn't speak for
Um,
anyone else. I am not saying everyone in domestic violence relationships is doing that. I'm saying I did it, and I know I'm not a snowflake, special snowflake. That's the unique one in the world. I'm not the only one that did it. If I did it, other people did. And just like earlier we were talking, if I have to be someone who says I did this horrendous thing in order to whatever, like okay, let's again, no shame. It's like it's not a
right.
good look, but I get why that happened. I understand that I had a protective system that I didn't know existed. And again, IFS, Eternal Family Systems, is such a compassionate and
Mm,
skillful way of making those parts of us not have to be in such extreme roles because those jobs suck. The job of protecting us with addiction, compulsion, distraction, whatever, that's a crappy job. And so
yeah.
those parts of me it takes a lot of effort to be a drug addict. Like all that energy was freed up to do other things when I no longer needed to protect myself from what was true that happened, what was true for me and about me.
Yeah. I think it's so challenging. I love the 12 steps, but I'm aware that they're not trauma informed. And so oftentimes when someone has done like a 4 step and they get into how they were, who they're resentful at, or I've had people that have had a lot of trauma who can't even um, connect with the idea of resentment, but they can connect with sadness, right? And then when it's revealed about like all kinds of trauma, it's like they don't have a part in that. They don't have a part. And I think that I love the 12 steps for its ability to, and help people take responsibility. Um, but I was always like, there's something else that needs to happen after this 12-step process, or maybe concurrently, there needs to be some trauma work
I
to
like to
address.
rewrite them when I'm working in practice with,
Do you?
addiction. I like to rewrite them in a more trauma, like step one, instead of I am an addict and I am powerless. It's, wow, bad things happened. I haven't been willing to deal with them. Life is not working. Okay. Step two. made a decision to start doing some stuff about it. Russell Brand has a really
I was
awesome
just
rewriting
thinking,
of the 12 steps. Like
yeah,
his is the best version, I think. But in
I
that
love it.
realm, and the fourth step is not taking a fearless and thorough moral
Searching
inventory. It's like,
fearless moral
how about let's
inventory.
just take an honest inventory? Like,
Yeah,
it's not fearless. It sucks. The fourth step was horrible. So like, you don't have to be fearless to do the work. You just need to be, again, willingness, not
willing.
fearlessness, assuming you're
Yeah,
safe. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I love the four step. That was probably the most profound thing that's ever happened to
Yeah.
me was
Me too.
that first initial like clarity. It's like, oh, that awkward moment where you realize you're the asshole. I was like, oh my God.
It's kind of empowering though. Like it took
Totally.
me out of, if I had a hand in this, and again, I am not saying I manifested it or that I deserved it or that
Right.
somehow I created
Manifesting.
it. No, I am saying if I take ownership of my responsibility in contributing, that means I
Yeah.
have taken some of my power
Power
back.
back.
And that is what ultimately got me out of it was the more and more of my own power I could tolerate, the more
Yeah.
energy I had to make things different.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. With a few minutes that we have left, we're gonna have to have you come back and talk. I do want to talk about some actual tools, though. If somebody feels overwhelm is something that I hear a lot. Especially people that are in early recovery. It's like, oh my gosh, people who do 12 steps. It's like, or there's a bazillion ways to do it, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say somebody is getting sober. They're doing 90 meetings in 90 days. They're searching for a sponsor or getting one. They are trying to manage difficult relationships. And listen, there's just a lot. And then there's podcasts and books and courses and therapies and coaches. It's like, like I was saying earlier, there's so many resources. So I think that really leads to a lot of overwhelm for people. And so if you find yourself in that, like, again, stuck, how would you, and we do the 3 steps to unstuck, which is brilliant. What other things have you listed in the book that we can kind of cover?
One of my favorite tools that can really help with the overwhelm is to stop speaking in metaphor. Like we use real, and it's an easy one to stop doing if you start noticing how often we do it. Oh my God, I'm just drowning in all this information. Oh my God, I just feel so buried by everything on my plate. I'm spinning 20 plates in the air. Like all of that metaphorical language is very big. And again, driver's ed for the brain. Our brain is very smart and it's also very literal sometimes. So if you tell yourself I'm drowning, your brain is going to deploy the resources to help save you from drowning, one of which being the freeze response. Like when you're drowning, your brain will shut everything down so you can conserve oxygen and so you don't die. So if you can say instead of I'm so overwhelmed and I'm drowning, it's wow, I have to take 2 kids to daycare today and I have to figure out how to pay my rent and I have to apply for 4 jobs. The more specific you can make your overwhelming circumstances, the easier your brain will have, like your brain will have an easier time decoding that this is a lot, but you're not being attacked by a tiger. So therefore we can take another step because overwhelm creates freeze. Metaphorical language creates overwhelm. So a real easy step is just don't speak in metaphors at all. I love metaphors. I love analogies, but not when you're in the middle of a crisis. We want really specific language. My life's a dumpster fire. I used to say that one. It's like, that's not helpful. It's not. It's okay. I don't know where I'm going to live if I leave this relationship and I have $16 in my checking account and a quarter of a tank of gas. And like, what do I do about X, Y, and Z? Because then you can get to solutions. If my life is just a dumpster fire, there's like, what am I supposed to do with that? There's nothing you can do to solve a metaphor. You can do lots of things to solve a problem.
This is so helpful. So good. So good. Um, what is maybe one other tool or tactic we can kind of cover maybe in terms of, because when you talk about, you just mentioned some very practical, real issues like how am I going to support myself if I leave this relationship? Where am I going to go? How, the money issues are a big deal for people. So those are overwhelmed. And we talk a lot about somatic work. Is there a somatic practice, whether it's like a breathing technique or something along those lines?
So this is sort of controversial, but I really hesitate to do somatic and breathing work while you're in the middle of a crisis. It's like
Okay.
the last place I want to be when I'm getting surgery is present. I'm like, I want the anesthesia. I want the dissociate. Dissociation is only a problem if you don't know that you're doing it and you don't know how to get
Mm,
back. But
mhm.
while you're in the middle of the crisis, don't do breathing. You don't need to be present. What we need to do is keep your system out of freeze, which is why I
Mm,
really like the 3 steps, because you don't need to get, eventually we're going to need to figure out what happened to you and what happened from this and what were the contributing factors and why, but not while you're in the crisis. And if we're talking, my somatic tools, I like for once we've got everything stable and it's time to come back home to yourself, then somatic tools are great. But I found that often breathing exercises when you're in crisis, for some people they work, and if they work for you, you do you. Awesome. For me and for a lot of people, trying to take a deep breath when you're overwhelmed makes it worse, especially if you have
mm,
anesthesia trauma or if you have strangulation trauma. Trying to force breath into your body is going to trip your nervous system out and create a fear response. It does the exact
wow.
opposite of what it's supposed to. And trauma informed breathwork practitioners know this and are very skillful at making sure people know this. But I didn't know that until way later in my journey, that, oh, taking a deep breath can actually make it. That's like being told to calm down never calms people down. Like
Relax.
that, yeah, just relax. Just take a deep breath. Just think
Just
positive.
just anything that comes after just makes me want to punch someone in the face.
Exactly. So if you are in stage one, step one, not even step one, if you're staring at the starting line, wondering, how do I get there? How do I even get to the starting gate? Don't
Yeah.
worry about why. Don't worry about how you feel. Like you said, mood follows action. Don't worry about what you're feeling. Don't worry about why this is a thing. Figure out what is an action step available to you now that can get you moving. Once we get momentum, all those other things are awesome. But like while the fire is burning, get the people out no matter what it takes.
Right. Okay, so let's assume we're not in crisis and maybe maybe is there is there another one of your favorite exercises that you list at the end? Because I know at the end of every chapter you have
Yeah.
like some exercises. What's some other
Yeah.
of your favorites?
And I am a somatic practitioner. I love this type of work, just not
Yeah.
early recovery.
Yeah.
Ice is my favorite one. And not everyone can tolerate ice like
No.
plunges, but there are lots of ways of using cold. Like
Okay.
if you're on a Zoom meeting at work and you're anxious, like shove some ice packs down the back of your shirt. Like you'd be shocked how many really high up, powerful executives are doing what they do with like ice packs shoved in their shirt and in their shoes and whatnot, because the sensation of extreme cold triggers your parasympathetic system. So it brings you down. So if you are just like on the ceiling with your hair, I'll use a metaphor here, with your hair on fire, ice cold, you don't have to take a cold shower if that's not your thing. You don't need to do a plunge if that's not your thing, but like put an ice pack on your face or on your neck, smell something. Like these are all very basic, annoying things that work, but they do work. But cold is my favorite intervention if you find yourself running on high alert and you can't seem to slow down.
Yeah, I love that. The ice, man, I never thought about that, like an ice pack
Hmm.
just on your hands. I remember talking to this lady one time and she was saying that she runs her hands under cold water.
Yeah, yeah.
I was like, oh, that's really interesting. But I like the idea of the ice pack because you don't have to do a cold plunge.
No,
Those
every
are very
office should
hard
be stocked with like gel packs in the freezer for meetings.
for meetings.
Yeah,
Everyone puts them on like a swollen ankle, but we need to put it on our swollen nervous
it's
system.
so true. I mean, if you think of again the metaphor, oh, they're so hot tempered and
Yeah.
oh my God, he was really spicy. It's like, yeah, there's a reason those metaphors exist. And the sensation of actual cold helps dial that down.
Oh my God, that's so great. I love that. Well, listen, well, there's so many. I feel like if we like pull on another thread, we'll be here for another hour. So I'm gonna try to wrap this up here. But I want to be sure that people get your book. You can find it on Amazon and all the places. It's called The Science of Stuck: Breaking Through Inertia to Find Your Path Forward, Making Forward Progress. So good. If people want to reach out to you, whether it's for a speaking engagement or just to connect, where can people find you?
Yeah, and thank you for that. My website is just scienceofstuck.com. You can find me on Instagram. It's just my name at
Yay.
Britt Frank. I'm on LinkedIn. I don't tweet. I don't do Twitter or
Me
Facebook.
neither. I got to tell you, I've been sharing all your stuff
Thank
on
you.
Instagram. as you may have seen, because you are taking out small, tiny, bite-sized pieces, micro yeses, and putting just simple things out there that are easy to absorb and implement. And I find that context and perspective can often lead me out of the forest, and help me get grounded again. And so I would highly encourage anyone to follow you on Instagram, because you are sharing a lot of really good, like valuable, practical, useful content there too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well,
Yes.
I wish that would existed when I started my process, but like to
I
date
know.
myself, I'm pre-Instagram, pre-social media when my shenanigans started. And it gets
Thank
a bad
God.
rap, but thank God it's not
Yeah.
documented anywhere.
Ooh.
But, social media has a lot of potential for good, not just potential
Yeah.
to keep us in a state of fear and, shut down.
Yeah, for sure. I think if I'm learning how to manage it without falling into the comparison trap, which
Yeah,
shorts me out
me
every
too.
time.
Me
I
too.
just get totally shorted out. So I'm learning to let go of external validation and only share or participate in a way that I feel good about, so that I don't fall to this fake world of social media and then start, that's old saying that you judge your insides by
Uh-huh.
looking at someone else's outsides.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Or judging your first mile to someone's finish line.
Oh, I like that
I didn't
one.
come up with that. I don't know who did, but like it's so
Love it.
true. I do it too. So
Yeah, of
social
course.
media, but you skillfully.
Skillfully. Yes. Well, my dear, thank you so much for your time today. And I'll look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you.